Hey guys, welcome back to Econ Class. Today we're going to be looking at price controls and quotas. So that's price ceilings, price floors, quotas, how they impact producer and consumer surplus, and then how they cause deadweight loss. So the objectives for today: identify and calculate the costs and benefits of price controls, illustrate the impact of price controls and quotas on consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus, and then identify and calculate the deadweight loss from price controls and quotas. And then finally, assess the impact of elasticity on price controls and quotas. A few terms to get us going. Price controls, all right, legal price minimum or maximum set by lawmakers to achieve some social goal. So maybe government thinks this price is too high, this price is too low. Maybe it's a necessity that they feel government should actually regulate the price so that consumers or producers get a better deal out of it. So we'll talk about different examples as we go along. Price ceiling and price floor. Price ceiling is a legal maximum. We cannot go any higher than it. That a price at which a good can be sold. So something that has a price ceiling would be rent control. Now price floors, we can't go below them. So a legal minimum on a price at which a good can be sold. So a good example of this, minimum wage. When people are paying for labor, they cannot pay any less than the minimum wage. So price ceilings, price floors, these are both types of price control. Now the first of the three models that we're going to look at is a price ceiling, that legal maximum price that we can't go any higher than. So what this ends up doing, if it is an effective or binding price ceiling, now what it means to be effective or binding is if we cannot get to equilibrium price. So it has to be set below the equilibrium price. What this ends up doing is reducing outcome. It will help some consumers because the consumers that can still get the products, they're going to get a better deal and get a lot more consumer surplus. It will end up hurting producers because that lower price will impact their producer surplus, and in the end, it's going to cause deadweight loss. Now let's look step by step at the actual impact of a binding price ceiling. So here we are in a market at equilibrium. We are at allocative efficiency. Our consumer and producer surplus is at a maximum. We are at no market loss, no deadweight loss. And the government decides to implement a price ceiling to achieve some sort of social desirable goal. Maybe we're going to help this particular group out. Let's put a price ceiling on college tuition to make sure that everybody has equal access to education. Something like that. Rent control, something of that nature. They implement this price ceiling. Now, a binding price ceiling has to be below equilibrium to actually have any impact. So as we put this price ceiling in, the quantity demanded obviously goes up because people want to buy more because there's a lower price. Now we know there's going to be a shortage in this situation because the quantity supplied is also going to go down. Quantity supplied is going to go down because price is lower. Producers respond to the law of supply, lower price, lower quantity supplied. So marginal sellers leave the market and producer surplus starts to decrease. That whole yellow area right there is lost producer surplus. That lower price causes all that to be lost. Now, not all of it's deadweight loss. Some of it's going to go to the consumers. But the buyers that are able to actually get the product, because the market is a lot smaller now and a lot more consumers want this particular product. So there is going to be a gain in consumer surplus of buyers that can actually get a hand on the product. So there's going to be some lost consumer surplus. There's going to be lost producer surplus. There's some gain to consumer surplus. But we definitely have some deadweight loss. So the size of the market is going to shrink. The quantity in the market is going to shrink because of that price ceiling interference. Anytime the government involves itself with price controls, it may benefit some part of a certain group, but there's definitely going to be deadweight loss. So it prevents the gains from trade. And this is where that deadweight loss comes in. All that producer and consumer surplus that would have been gained had we still been at the equilibrium quantity is now lost. And nobody's getting it. It's just dead to the world. So consumer surplus went up in some situations to consumers that could still get their hands on the product, but producer surplus definitely went down and there's definitely deadweight loss. Price ceilings can shift from binding to non-binding and non-binding to binding as markets change. As supply and demand shift, equilibrium price will change, altering the effectiveness of a price ceiling. So we're going to look at an example of a binding to non-binding occurrence from a shift in supply. So we see supply increase. As supply increase, we establish a new equilibrium that brings down our consumer surplus. It eliminates the effectiveness of the price ceiling because now equilibrium is at the price ceiling. There's no restrictions. There's no market loss in this particular example. So we gain back a lot of consumer surplus, and we gain back all the producer surplus. So once again, because it's a non-binding price ceiling at this point, because of that increase in supply, we've gone back to allocative efficiency. There is zero deadweight loss at this point. All right, now a price floor is a legal minimum, the price that can be offered in the market. All right, a binding price floor is one that's going to be above the equilibrium price and not allow us to get down to it. It's initially going to cause a surplus because producers are going to want to produce more at the higher price, consumers are going to want to buy less at that higher price, but either way, it's definitely going to distort the market outcome. So what it'll do in the end is reduce consumption, help some producers, the ones that are still able to get rid of their products, hurt consumers because it's going to be a higher price, they're going to lose their consumer surplus, and in the end it's definitely going to cause deadweight loss because it's going to shrink the market size. Let's look at the step-by-step impact of a binding price floor. We're going to start this market off at an allocative efficiency as well, and then we're going to put this binding price floor. Now a binding or effective price floor is above equilibrium price like this one. They're trying to achieve some socially desirable goal by fixing this price higher than the equilibrium currently is. So this higher price level is going to cause consumers to leave the market. Those marginal buyers are going to jump ship, and it's going to shrink the size of the market. We are going to lose consumer surplus because less buyers are buying the product, plus it's at a higher price for the remaining consumers. So that green area represents all the lost consumer surplus. The white represents the lost producer surplus simply because the market size has shrunk. Now, some of this lost consumer surplus is going to shift to producer surplus because of that higher price. So we've got our lost consumer surplus, our lost producer surplus because of the smaller market size. Consumer surplus has definitely shrunk. Producer surplus, depending on the situation, looks like it went up a little bit because of that higher price. But the yellow is going to shift into what we call deadweight loss, that loss to the market, the loss to consumer and producer surplus due to the shrinking size of the market. So we're going to look at an example of how a shift in supply can impact the effectiveness of a price floor. Now we have a market in allocative efficiency, and we're going to throw this price floor in the market. Now currently, this is a non-binding price floor. It is below equilibrium. It has no impact on the market. We are still able to get to equilibrium. We're still able to acquire allocative efficiency. Consumer and producer surplus is at a maximum based on the current equilibrium. But we're going to see supply shift to the right. An increase in supply is going to drop the price. Now all of a sudden, this non-binding price floor becomes binding. And because of this binding price floor, the market is cut off at QPF. Consumer surplus in this particular example is going to increase from where it was simply because the market is larger because supply went up, but it's still going to cause some deadweight loss. So everything below the price that's within the market, above the supply curve, is going to be our producer surplus, and this little area right here is now going to be our deadweight loss. So we've gone from a non-binding to binding price floor. And once it goes to binding, it's always going to cause some deadweight loss. Now the last model we need to cover is a restrictive or binding production quota. All right, now this is when the government comes in and says, for some reason or another, maybe pollution, maybe just preserving resources, they come in and they say you can only produce X amount of goods. You cannot produce beyond that. So they're going to draw a line. They're going to say this quantity is as much as the market can produce. So in this case, QQ is our quota. We can't produce anything beyond that. So the interesting part of this one is how the supply curve turns out. Now this blue section of the supply curve represents what naturally is going to occur. The law of supply takes effect as price goes up, quantity supply goes up with it, up until that quota. And at that point, it just shoots straight up because at that point, they cannot produce any more. This is our perfectly inelastic portion of our supply curve because that's the amount that they can produce. Now, we create a new equilibrium out of this, and we have a new price, PQ, resulting from the quota, from our new supply curve. And this is definitely going to cause a higher price, and it's going to reduce consumer surplus in the market. But that higher price is also going to cause producer surplus to go up. However, because the market has shrunk, because of that restrictive quota, we've shrunk our market size, we've declined the market from QE to QQ, and it's going to result in some deadweight loss. We've lost this portion of the market. Producers might be a little better off depending on their situation. They might be worse off if they're not one producing anymore, but there's going to be deadweight loss, and that means there's some consumer surplus loss, some producer surplus loss. Now before we're done, I want to talk a little bit about how elasticity impacts the market. Now, Inelastic markets have less deadweight loss than elastic markets, all right? The more responsive people are to prices, the more deadweight loss there's going to be in a given market. So let's take a look at some examples. In this particular curve, we've got two relatively elastic curves. And when we put this binding price ceiling in the market, it is going to result in deadweight loss of about that area, all right? Now we're going to kind of take back a little bit on elasticity and look at this model, all right? They're not quite as elastic as they were in the previous model, and deadweight loss is much lower in this particular example. The same price ceiling, the same original equilibrium price, but because the curves are a little more inelastic, we have less deadweight loss. We're going to take it one to an extreme. Now, these are relatively inelastic supply and demand curves, same equilibrium price, same exact price level, and our deadweight loss is even smaller. So the more inelastic the market, the more inelastic the supply and demand curves are, the less deadweight loss we are going to see from a given price ceiling, price floor, or quota. All right, guys, hopefully you got something out of that. Please take a second to look in the description below and check out the link to the worksheet available for you to practice this concept. And then make sure you're taking a look at the follow-up video going over that practice worksheet, as well as the other videos I've provided for Unit 2. All right, guys, thank you for watching. I'll see you guys next time.